I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who questions every text message, analyzes every glance, or lies awake at night piecing together fragments of suspicious behavior like some amateur detective. But here I am, 29 years old, married for 10 years to a man I thought I knew completely, and I'm drowning in a sea of doubt that started as a tiny ripple 7 months ago. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I'm every woman who has ever felt that gnawing sensation in her gut, that primal instinct that something fundamental has shifted in her world. I'm the woman who married her high school sweetheart, who built a life with someone, who created a family and a home, only to watch it all slowly unravel through a series of small changes that, when viewed individually, could be explained away as stress, work pressure, or the natural evolution of a long marriage. But when you step back and look at the whole picture, the pattern becomes undeniable. It started in January, though I didn't recognize it then. My husband, let's call him Mark, had always been affectionate. Not overly romantic, but present. He'd kiss me goodbye in the morning, tell me about his day over dinner, reach for my hand while we watched TV. We had our routine, our rhythm, the comfortable dance of two people who'd grown up together and learned to navigate life as a team. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I'd made his favorite dinner, pot roast with those little potatoes he always said reminded him of his grandmother's cooking. I'd spent the afternoon preparing it, thinking about how we could reconnect after what had been a particularly stressful few weeks at both our jobs. When he walked through the door, I expected the usual tired smile, maybe a comment about the smell of dinner welcoming him home. Instead, he barely glanced at me. His eyes swept the room like he was looking for something, or someone else. When I asked about his day, he gave me the kind of generic response you'd give a coworker in an elevator. Work was fine. Traffic was bad. What's for dinner? The conversation felt hollow, like we were reading lines from a script neither of us had rehearsed properly. I told myself he was just tired. The cable company had been restructuring, and Mark had mentioned increased pressure to meet installation quotas. Everyone deals with stress differently, and maybe this was just his way of coping. I made excuses for him then, the way you do when you love someone and can't bear to consider the alternative explanations for their behavior. But the distance didn't disappear after a good night's sleep or a relaxing weekend. If anything, it grew wider. The morning kisses became perfunctory pecks, delivered while he was already mentally somewhere else. The hand-holding stopped entirely. Even our physical intimacy, which had never been passionate but had always been consistent and loving, transformed into something that felt transactional. He'd initiate when he needed release, but there was no tenderness, no connection. I felt like a convenience rather than a partner, a body rather than the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. The worst part was how he looked at me, or rather, how he didn't look at me. When we'd pass in the hallway, his eyes would slide away from mine as if maintaining eye contact was somehow painful. When I'd catch him staring in my direction, his expression wasn't loving or even neutral, it was almost critical, like he was cataloging my flaws or finding reasons to justify something I couldn't see coming. I started paying attention to small details in a way I never had before. The way he'd position his body when we sat on the couch, always maintaining at least a foot of space between us. How he'd suddenly develop a pressing need to check his phone whenever I tried to start a meaningful conversation. The way our discussions narrowed to logistics, who was picking up the kids, what bills needed paying, whose turn it was to go grocery shopping. We'd been together for a decade, married for most of that time, and suddenly we were communicating like roommates who barely tolerated each other's presence. The sneakiness began in March. That's when I noticed his phone habits changing dramatically. Mark had never been particularly attached to his device before. He'd leave it charging in the kitchen overnight, forget it in his car, sometimes go hours without checking it. But seemingly overnight, it became an extension of his hand. He'd take it to the bathroom, keep it face down during dinner, sleep with it under his pillow. The work schedule changes came next. Mark had always been a 9 to 5 kind of guy, home by 5:30 most evenings unless there was an emergency call. Cable installation doesn't typically require evening hours. Most customers want technicians during the day when they're home to let them in. So when he started staying at the office until 10 or 11 at night, claiming he was catching up on paperwork or helping with inventory, my suspicion radar began pinging. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe the company restructuring really had created more administrative work. Maybe his supervisor was demanding more detailed reports. Maybe he was picking up overtime to help with our finances. I wanted to believe these explanations because the alternative was too devastating to consider. But then I remembered Sarah. Sarah is my best friend. She's also Mark's ex-wife and the mother of his older child, Emma. I know how that sounds. What kind of woman becomes best friends with her husband's ex? It's complicated, messy, and probably not the healthiest dynamic, but it's our reality. When Mark and I started dating in high school, he was already a father. He and Sarah had gotten pregnant young, married even younger, and divorced by the time they were 21. She was painted as the villain in Mark's version of their story, irresponsible, selfish, more interested in partying than parenting. He had primary custody of Emma, and Sarah was portrayed as the flaky ex who couldn't be relied upon for anything. For the first few years of our relationship, I believed this narrative completely. Sarah was the obstacle to our perfect family, the complication that reminded us Mark had a past he'd rather forget. When she'd come to pick up Emma for her visitation weekends, I'd watch from the window as they exchanged terse words and barely made eye contact. But as Emma got older and started expressing her own needs and opinions, it became clear that the three-way hostility wasn't serving anyone, especially not the child caught in the middle. Emma loved both her parents and wanted them to get along. She'd make comments about how other divorced parents in her class could attend school functions together without drama, and how she wished her family could do the same. So we tried co-parenting therapy. We attended family counseling sessions where a professional helped us navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of raising a child across 2 households. Through that process, I began to see Sarah not as the villain Mark had described, but as a young woman who'd made mistakes, grown from them, and was genuinely trying to be a better mother. She was funny, intelligent, and surprisingly supportive when I was struggling with my own parenting challenges with the kids Mark and I had together. She'd text me advice about dealing with teenage attitude or recommend pediatricians when one of the kids was sick. We started talking more frequently, first about Emma and practical co-parenting issues, then about life in general. Before I knew it, Sarah had become one of my closest friends. She was the person I'd call when I needed to vent about work stress or celebrate small victories. She knew my fears, my dreams, my insecurities about being a good mother and wife. We'd have long conversations about everything from parenting strategies to career goals to relationship challenges. Which is why, when I started noticing Mark's changed behavior, one of the first people I wanted to talk to about it was Sarah. She knew him better than almost anyone. They'd been married, they'd raised a child together, they'd seen each other at their worst and found a way to build a functional co-parenting relationship afterward. But something strange happened when I mentioned my concerns to her in April. We were having coffee at our usual spot, a little cafe halfway between our houses where we'd meet monthly to catch up and plan Emma's summer schedule. I'd been debating whether to bring up Mark's recent distance, but the words tumbled out before I could stop them. I told her about the phone attachment, the late work nights, the way he'd been pulling away from me emotionally and physically. I expected her to offer the kind of supportive advice she'd always given before, maybe suggestions about how to reconnect with him, or reassurance that all marriages go through rough patches. Instead, she went completely quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of someone thinking through a response, but the tense silence of someone who's been caught off guard. Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips, and I watched her face carefully arrange itself into what she probably thought was a neutral expression. When she finally spoke, her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for this conversation. She suggested that Mark might be dealing with work stress, that men sometimes withdraw when they're feeling overwhelmed, that I should give him space and see if things improved on their own. It wasn't bad advice, but it wasn't Sarah's usual approach. Typically, she'd ask probing questions, offer to help brainstorm solutions, maybe share similar experiences from her own relationships. This time, she seemed eager to change the subject, and she left our coffee date earlier than usual, claiming she had errands to run. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in our conversation. I replayed it over and over, analyzing her responses, her body language, the way she'd avoided making eye contact when I mentioned Mark's behavioral changes. And then I remembered something that made my stomach drop. 3 years into our marriage, during what I'd thought was a brief rough patch, I'd discovered that Mark had been in contact with Sarah. Not just co-parenting contact, personal, intimate contact. Text messages that went beyond discussing Emma's school schedule or medical appointments. Late-night conversations that had nothing to do with their daughter and everything to do with their shared history. When I'd confronted him about it, he'd insisted it was innocent, that they were just talking through some unresolved issues from their divorce. He'd claimed that maintaining a good relationship with Sarah was important for Emma's sake, and that I was being jealous and possessive for questioning their communication. I'd believed him then, partly because I wanted to and partly because the evidence was circumstantial. They weren't meeting in person, there were no explicit messages, and Mark had eventually agreed to limit their contact to co-parenting matters only. I'd chalked it up to the complicated emotions that come with divorce and remarriage, and we'd moved forward. But now, 3 years later, with Mark exhibiting all the classic signs of someone hiding something, that old incident took on new significance. What if it hadn't been innocent? What if they'd never really stopped their inappropriate contact? What if my best friend, the woman I'd trusted with my deepest fears and insecurities, had been betraying me all along? The thought was so devastating that I tried to push it away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my imagination was running wild, that I was connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture. But the suspicion had taken root, and once it was there, I couldn't stop seeing potential evidence everywhere. I started paying closer attention to Mark's behavior patterns. The late work nights seemed to coincide with evenings when Sarah didn't have Emma. The bathroom visits with his phone always lasted exactly long enough for a substantial conversation. When he played video games on his computer late at night, I began listening more carefully to the sounds coming from the living room. Video games have a specific rhythm, the repetitive clicking of movement keys, the occasional burst of rapid-fire action, the steady background music and sound effects. But some nights, I'd hear something different. The quick, continuous tapping of someone typing a message, followed by long pauses, then more typing. The sounds of someone having a text conversation, not playing a game. I started keeping a notebook, just a small one that I could hide in my drawer. I'd write down dates and times when his behavior seemed off, when his explanations didn't quite match his actions, when my gut feeling was particularly strong. What began as a few scattered observations quickly became pages of detailed notes. April 15th, claimed to work late, but Emma mentioned Sarah had to cancel their dinner plans last minute because something came up. April 22nd, spent 45 minutes in bathroom with phone. When I knocked to ask if he was okay, he seemed startled and took another 5 minutes before coming out. April 28th, playing games until 2 a.m., but I heard typing sounds for at least 30 minutes. When I got up for water, he quickly minimized something on his screen. May 3rd, Sarah was unusually short during our text conversation about Emma's dance recital. Usually sends paragraph responses, but gave one-word answers. The list went on and on. Individual entries that could be explained away as coincidence or innocent behavior, but collectively painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. I tried direct confrontation twice. The first time, in early May, I sat Mark down after the kids were in bed and told him I was concerned about the distance between us. I asked if there was anything he wanted to talk about, if he was dealing with stress I didn't know about, if there was anything I could do to help. His response was textbook gaslighting, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. He turned my concerns back on me, suggesting that I was being overly needy and clingy. He questioned my mental state, wondering aloud if I might be experiencing some kind of hormonal imbalance or depression that was making me paranoid. He reminded me of times in the past when I'd been wrong about my suspicions, making me doubt my own perceptions and judgment. By the end of that conversation, I felt like I was the one who needed to apologize. I went to bed questioning my own sanity, wondering if I really was being unreasonable and possessive. The second confrontation happened after I finally worked up the courage to ask Sarah directly about her relationship with Mark. I approached it carefully, framing it as concern for our co-parenting dynamic rather than accusation. I mentioned that Mark seemed stressed lately and asked if she'd noticed any changes in his behavior during their interactions about Emma. Her reaction confirmed my worst fears. Instead of the open, honest communication we'd always had, she became defensive and evasive. She insisted that she barely spoke to Mark except about Emma, that she hadn't noticed any changes in his behavior, and that I was probably just going through a rough patch that all marriages experience. But then she stopped texting me. Sarah, who had been in daily contact with me for over a year, suddenly became virtually silent. Our frequent coffee dates were canceled due to busy schedules. Our long evening conversations about everything and nothing stopped entirely. When I did hear from her, her messages were brief and focused solely on logistics regarding Emma. The change was so dramatic that even Emma noticed. She asked me why Sarah didn't come around as much anymore, why our family barbecues had stopped happening, why the easy friendship that had made her life so much more stable seemed to have evaporated overnight. I didn't know how to answer her. How do you explain to a teenager that you suspect her mother and stepfather might be having an affair? How do you articulate the gut-wrenching realization that the two people you trust most in the world might be betraying you together? Meanwhile, Mark's behavior became even more suspicious. He started taking his phone into the shower with him, claiming he was listening to music but always emerging from the bathroom looking like he'd been in an intense conversation. He'd receive text messages at odd hours and immediately delete them after reading. When I'd ask who was texting him so late, he'd give vague answers about work colleagues or old friends. The gaming sessions became his primary hiding spot. He'd stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning, long after I'd gone to bed, supposedly playing online games with friends. But when I'd listen from the bedroom, the pattern was always the same: periods of actual gaming sounds interrupted by long stretches of typing and silence. One night in June, I made a decision that felt both completely rational and totally insane. I waited until Mark was asleep, then carefully removed his phone from under his pillow. My hands were shaking as I tried to unlock it, but he'd changed his passcode, something he'd never done in all our years together. I tried every combination I could think of. Our anniversary, the kids' birthdays, his social security number, my birthday. Nothing worked. After 20 minutes of failed attempts, I gave up, terrified that I'd trigger some kind of lockout that would alert him to my snooping. The next day, I tried to access his computer while he was at work. Mark had always been protective of his personal files, but he'd never hidden his computer activity from me before. Now, I found folder after folder of empty directories, like someone had systematically cleaned out anything that might be incriminating. His browser history was completely clear, his email was logged out, and his desktop was suspiciously organized, nothing like the cluttered digital workspace he'd always maintained. The lack of evidence was almost more damning than finding something concrete would have been. People don't typically go to such lengths to hide innocent activity. The digital cleanup felt deliberate, like someone who knew they were being watched and had taken steps to cover their tracks. I started paying attention to timing patterns. Mark's late work nights seemed to correlate with evenings when Sarah was free. His longest bathroom phone sessions happened on days when I knew she was alone. The most intense gaming sessions, the ones with the most typing sounds, occurred when Emma was staying with friends and Sarah didn't have parenting responsibilities. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Every day brought new small observations that supported my theory, but never the concrete proof I needed to feel justified in my suspicions. I'd catch Mark in small lies, claiming to be at work when his colleague called the house looking for him, saying he'd grab dinner on the way home when he arrived empty-handed. None of these were major deceptions, but they created a pattern of dishonesty that made me question everything he told me. The emotional toll was devastating. I'd wake up each morning hoping that today would be the day my suspicions were proven wrong, that Mark would return to being the husband I'd fallen in love with, that Sarah would reach out with the kind of friendship and support I'd come to depend on. Instead, each day brought new evidence of the growing distance between Mark and me, the continued silence from Sarah, and the sickening certainty that something fundamental had changed in my life without my permission or understanding. I started experiencing physical symptoms of the stress. My appetite disappeared, leading to weight loss that made me look gaunt and tired. I had trouble sleeping, lying awake for hours analyzing every interaction, every glance, every tone of voice for hidden meaning. My work performance suffered as I found myself distracted by obsessive thoughts about what might be happening behind my back. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't talk to Sarah, who had been my primary emotional support system. I couldn't confide in other friends without feeling like I was betraying Mark or admitting that my marriage might be falling apart. I couldn't discuss it with family members who would either dismiss my concerns or become overly involved in a situation I wasn't ready to make public. So I suffered in silence, carrying the weight of my suspicions alone, watching my husband become increasingly distant and my best friend fade from my life entirely. The gaslighting intensified whenever I tried to address the situation directly. Mark became expert at making me question my own perceptions, my memory, even my mental health. He'd deny having conversations I clearly remembered, claim I was imagining changes in his behavior that were obvious to anyone paying attention, and suggest that my concerns were signs of jealousy or insecurity rather than legitimate observations about his conduct. After each of these conversations, I'd feel like I was the problem. Maybe I was being too sensitive, too demanding, too suspicious. Maybe long marriages naturally evolved into periods of distance and disconnection. Maybe I was sabotaging my own happiness by looking for problems that didn't exist. But then I'd notice him standing outside our bedroom door for 10 minutes at a time, completely still, obviously focused on his phone. Or I'd catch him quickly switching screens when I walked into the room. Or I'd see him smile while reading a text message in a way he hadn't smiled at me in months. And I'd know, with absolute certainty, that I wasn't imagining anything. The situation reached a breaking point in July. Emma was staying with us for 2 weeks while Sarah took a vacation, something that should have been a normal part of our co-parenting routine. But this time, Mark seemed anxious and distracted in a way that went beyond his usual discomfort with having his ex-wife travel. He checked his phone compulsively, even more than usual. He'd disappear for phone calls that he claimed were work-related but which happened at odd hours and lasted far longer than any cable company business would require. He seemed to be waiting for something, checking the time frequently and becoming increasingly agitated as the days passed. On the 5th day of Emma's stay, I overheard him having a hushed conversation in the garage while he was supposedly organizing his tools. I couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was intimate, urgent, and nothing like the casual conversations he'd have with male friends or colleagues. When he came back inside, he was in a visibly better mood than he'd been all week. He was almost cheerful, humming while he made lunch, engaging with the kids in a way he hadn't done in months. It was like he'd received news that relieved some enormous pressure he'd been carrying. That evening, while Emma was at a friend's house and our other kids were asleep, I made one final attempt to salvage our marriage through honest communication. I told Mark that I loved him, that I wanted our relationship to work, but that I needed him to be honest with me about what was happening in his life. I explained that I didn't recognize the man he'd become over the past 7 months, that the distance between us was killing me, and that I needed to understand what had changed so we could figure out how to fix it together. His response was the cruelest form of gaslighting yet. He told me that nothing had changed except my perception, that I'd become paranoid and controlling, that my constant suspicion was pushing him away and creating problems where none existed. He suggested that I needed professional help to deal with my jealousy and insecurity issues. He made me feel like the villain in my own story, like I was the one destroying our marriage through my inability to trust and communicate effectively. By the time he was finished, I was crying, confused, and ready to accept full responsibility for the deterioration of our relationship. But that night, lying in bed while he played games in the living room, I heard something that changed everything. Instead of the usual mix of gaming sounds and occasional typing, I heard him talking. Not loudly, but clearly engaged in a conversation with someone. The tone was affectionate, intimate, and completely unlike any conversation he'd had with me in months. I crept to the bedroom door and listened more carefully. While I couldn't make out specific words, I could hear the rhythm of flirtation, the kind of playful back and forth that couples engage in when they're falling in love or rekindling romance. It was 2:30 in the morning. No legitimate work call or casual friendship would be happening at that hour. This was the sound of someone having an affair, someone who thought his wife was safely asleep and couldn't overhear his betrayal. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, finally accepting what I'd been trying to deny for months. My husband was cheating on me. The woman I'd considered my best friend was almost certainly his partner in that betrayal. The life I'd built, the family I'd created, the future I'd planned was built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath my feet. The next morning, Mark was in another unusually good mood. He made coffee for both of us, something he hadn't done in months. He asked about my plans for the day, made small talk about the weather, even complimented my hair. It was like he was a different person, or rather, like he was making an effort to be the person he used to be. But instead of making me feel better, his sudden attention felt like another form of manipulation. Was he being nice because he felt guilty about his late-night conversation? Was he trying to throw me off the scent of his affair? Or was he just in a good mood because he'd had intimate contact with someone who wasn't his wife? I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of deception or guilt. But Mark had always been good at compartmentalizing, at keeping different parts of his life separate. If he was feeling guilty about betraying me, he'd gotten very good at hiding it. As I write this, 7 months after the changes in his behavior began, I'm still in the same impossible position. I know, in my heart and my gut, that my husband is having an affair with my best friend. The evidence is overwhelming when viewed as a whole: the timing, the secrecy, the changes in both their behavior, the way they've both worked to gaslight me into doubting my own perceptions. But I don't have the smoking gun. I don't have text messages, photos, or witnesses. I don't have the kind of concrete proof that would make me feel justified in blowing up my family's life based on my suspicions. And so I'm trapped in this horrible limbo, watching my marriage deteriorate while pretending everything is normal, losing my best friend while maintaining the facade of co-parenting cooperation, and slowly losing pieces of myself to the constant stress and uncertainty. I love my husband. Despite everything, despite the distance and the lies and the growing certainty that he's betraying me, I still love the man I married. I love the father he is to our children, the life we've built together, the future we'd planned. I don't want to be divorced. I don't want to be a single mother. I don't want to destroy my family based on intuition and circumstantial evidence. But I also can't continue living this way. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine while my heart breaks a little more each day. I can't keep making excuses for behavior that, in my soul, I know is inexcusable. I can't keep gaslighting myself to preserve a marriage that may already be over. The notebook full of suspicious incidents is now 30 pages long. The weight of carrying this secret is crushing me. The isolation of not being able to trust the two people closest to me is devastating. I'm 29 years old, and I feel like my life is falling apart in slow motion while everyone around me pretends not to notice. I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to get the proof I need or how to move forward without it. I don't know if I should fight for my marriage or accept that it's already over. I don't know if I should confront Sarah one more time or cut her out of my life entirely. What I do know is that I can't continue living in this state of suspended animation, waiting for someone else to make the choice about my future. I can't keep letting Mark gaslight me into doubting my own reality. I can't keep pretending that this gnawing feeling in my gut isn't telling me something crucial about my life. The truth has a way of emerging, whether we're ready for it or not. Secrets have a way of becoming too heavy to carry. And intuition, that deep, primal knowledge that something fundamental has shifted, rarely lies to us, even when we desperately want it to. I'm still the woman who married her high school sweetheart, who built a family and a home, who believed in love and commitment and the possibility of growing old with someone who truly knew and cherished her. But I'm also becoming someone else, someone who recognizes that love isn't always enough, that trust once broken may never fully heal, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is face a truth that will change everything. My story isn't over yet. I don't know how it ends, whether with reconciliation or divorce, with proof of my suspicions or the discovery that I've been wrong about everything. But I know that I deserve better than this limbo of uncertainty and betrayal. I deserve a partner who doesn't make me question my own sanity. I deserve friendships built on honesty rather than deception. I deserve a life where my gut instincts are trusted rather than dismissed, where my concerns are addressed rather than used against me. Most of all, I deserve to know the truth about my own life, even if that truth is painful. Because living in uncertainty is its own form of hell, and I've been there long enough. The story continues, but for now, this is where I am, a woman who trusted her heart, lost her peace of mind, and is slowly finding the courage to demand better for herself and her children. A woman who is learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than you deserve, even when that means facing the possibility that everything you believed about your life was built on a lie.